So now that we've analyzed married life for Abe and Sarah, the last question that I want us to think about is, do they really have to get married? Is there a way they can get these gains from efficiency without being married? And the answer is yes, they can. Because instead of marriage, we have maybe an institution called trade. Now, in the example of Abe and Sarah, maybe trade will be something that we don't want to consider. But if we're talking about other institution, of other example, I think trade is a very reasonable way to get around this issue of specialization. After all, we don't want to marry every person we want to have some gains from specialization from. So how do we do this? What is trade in this case? The first thing that we have to think about is what are the prices in which the two parties would be willing to trade at. So in this case, what are the prices in which, or between which, Abe and Sarah will be willing to trade? And the second step that we want to think about is what would these prices allow them to achieve? So let's start with this issue of prices. What prices would encourage them to trade? And the answer is, of course, that the prices depend on the opportunity costs. And let's think about that for a moment. We calculated the opportunity cost of a market good, and we said that for Sarah it's equal to 1/2, and for Abe it's equal to 1/4. If you're trading with someone, you always want to sell at a price that's higher than the cost of production, and you want to buy it at a price that's lower than your cost of production. So in this case, Abe is selling market goods, so he will only sell them at a price that's higher than his price. And in this case, we don't have prices in terms of dollars, but we do have prices in terms of opportunity cost. So Abe wants to sell the good at a price that's higher than his opportunity cost of 1/4. And Sarah, of course, wants to buy a home good at a price that's lower than the price that she would have to pay if she made it herself. Right? She's buying the good, so she wants the price to be lower than her opportunity cost. So the price for trade will have to be between 1/2 and 1/4. Let's choose a price between 1/2 and 1/4, just for the sake of this example. Let's choose a price of 1/3. And with this price of 1/3, we can go ahead and we can plot their trading line or consumption possibility frontiers. So I've drawn Sarah's production possibility frontier again, and once again I'm going to put home goods on the vertical axis and market goods on the horizontal axis, and this is the same production possibility frontier that we drew in the beginning of this lecture. And what I would like to add to this production possibility frontier is her consumption possibility frontier, or sometimes it's also called the trade line. And so we set a price for market goods in terms of home goods, and we said that suppose Sarah can trade with the rest of the world with a price ratio of one market good being equal to 1/3 home good. And another way of saying this is that 1 unit of a home good is going to equal to 3 units of market goods. So what does this mean in terms of her consumption possibility frontier? The first thing that we have to remember, of course, is that Sarah is going to specialize in home goods. Right? She will specialize in home goods because that is where she has a comparative advantage. And so she will be creating 6 units of home goods, and she'll be able to trade them in the marketplace. And for each 1 unit of home good, she will be getting 3 units of market goods. So the maximum number of market goods she can get is going to be 60 times 3, which is equal to 180. So if I was going to draw her consumption possibility frontier, I would have to extend this graph, and I would have to draw a straight line that goes from 60 all the way to 180. And we can see that her consumption possibility frontier is outside her production possibility frontier. So suddenly Sarah can consume things over and above what she can produce. A point such as this point here, a point E, a point that was unattainable before, is now suddenly attainable because she's specializing in the good for which she has a comparative advantage. Similarly, if we drew Abe's production possibility frontier and Abe's trade line, we would see that Abe's trade line is outside Abe's production possibility frontier. And I think you have the tools to do this by yourself. I'd like you to think about a couple of things. The first thing that I want you to think about is how the price ratio affects the consumption possibility frontier or the trade line. Clearly, the more you get for what you're producing, the better off you are. So if you're producing home goods and the price of a home good increases, then your consumption possibility frontier is going to rotate out. And if you're producing home goods and the price of a home good decreases, your consumption possibility frontier is going to shift in. Just a little trick about my example, I want you to think about what is the trade line if Abe and Sarah traded as opposed to married. In other words, what were the implicit prices that I assumed in my example? If you remember, in my example, Abe remained on his production possibility frontier, and Sarah allowed herself to be outside her production possibility frontier. So I want you to think about what those prices are. And that's quite a challenging problem to think about. So we see from the graph that we drew together that what trading allows us is to consume more than we produce. So it allows the consumption possibility frontier, or sometimes this is referred to as the trade line, to be different from the production possibility frontier. And specifically, it allows the trade line to be, or to have parts of it that are outside the production possibility frontier. When we draw a consumption possibility frontier, we have to take two things into account. The first thing is we have to realize that it has to touch the PPF in at least one point. Right? You have to have something to trade. You can't just eat without producing. So there has to be at least one point where the consumption possibility frontier is touching the production possibility frontier. On the other hand, we have to draw it in such a way that it's never actually inside the PPF. You can never be made worse off by trade, because if nothing else, you can decide not to trade. Right? If nothing else, you can eat what you're actually producing yourself. In other words, the CPF, when we draw it, it has to touch the PPF, but it mustn't be inside the PPF at any point. And as you do this week's homework assignment, I want you to think about that, because it's a little bit of challenging the first time you try to play around with this and make some examples. So I think you're almost ready for this week's homework assignment, but before we do that, let's just summarize what we've done so far, because this will get us ready for next week's assignment together and the next week's material. So just in terms of summary, what we learned this week, we learned about the opportunity cost, we learned about constraints, we learned about production possibility frontier, and we ended up with this concept of comparative advantage, and that comparative advantage is the basis for exchange. We've seen that specialization and trade, according to comparative advantages, increase our consumption. They allow us to eat more than we produce. They allow us to have more than our own individual resources would allow us to achieve. Of course, specialization requires exchange. For me to specialize in one thing, you have to specialize in something else so that the two of us can trade one good for the other good. And of course, if we're going to have exchange, then we must have trade and markets. So the next step is to think about markets, and that then we'll be able to see how trading that leads to specialization, because it permits specialization, then allows us to develop markets. And the next step is to think about these developed markets and think about how are we going to model them, and how are we going to think about the determination of prices and quantities in these markets where we're going ahead and trading goods.